Welcome to the second of two tidbits from Daniel chapter 7. It is a complicated and controversial chapter, so maybe I will add a little to the controversy. Last time we looked at the sequence of the events in the chapter. Daniel sees a vision in the midst of the night. 4 monsters representing world empires and the human dominion arise from the sea, the abyss. Then the heavenly court is set. These world empires are all rejected, and the Son of Man, Christ, is approved to be king forever. We see his second coming and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. This time we will look a little at some details, some historical aspects of the prophecy, and we will look a little more on the enemies of Christ. And let me remind you, it is not possible to recognize Antichrist unless you know Christ. So we will try to look at these enemies who are presented before the Son of Man in the chapter, to look at them from the perspective of the Son of Man. That is, how do they differ? And the first observation, these are all monsters, they are hybrids, they are beasts of prey. They gain their dominion through the exercise of power. In contrast, the Son of Man is what this title or expression indicates, simply a human being. In the context of the vision, that means someone who is weak and meek and humble. Now there is a background. In chapter 4 of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, in his exploitation of his people, in his attempt to be like God, turns into a beast. We notice and recognize that phenomenon throughout human history. Whenever human rulers try to become like God, they end up becoming beast. Nebuchadnezzar, in that chapter, is like a foretaste of what is to come. God shows how Babylon is judged. God extends his mercy, but in the end, as chapter 7 will show, and as chapter 5 already told us through the story of Belshazzar, in the end, God will judge these kingdoms. So chapter 4 is like a prelude to the judgment scene in chapter 7. In chapter 4, the judgment is pronounced from heaven, decided by a council in heaven, the watchers in heaven they are called. And here in chapter 7, we see that scene, the final scene. So, in chapter 4, it is clearly told that God will turn around the fate of those who aspire for high offices. They will be humbled, and he will put the most lowly, the most humble, over the kingdom. That person, that character, is then shown us in chapter 7 in the Son of Man, in Jesus Christ. So that's the first. The enemies, in contrast to the Son of Man, aspire to gain their dominance through power. Now, as you move on in the description of the history of the world empires, and they're explained as empires and they are named in the book, you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and though Rome is not named, this is the natural the natural successor to the Alexandrian Empire. But then the last monster, that is Rome, has a different aspect. There is a little horn growing, and as you read, you will find that this is constantly referred to as a different kind of power. So let us for a moment look at history. The beast in Daniel 7 is presented to us in two stages, at least in two stages. It has 10 horns, and then there's a little horn who grows up and uproots 3 of the horns. Oh, the amount of speculation on these horns abounds. Now, let me be a little controversial. It is very common to interpret these 10 horns as 10 people groups or tribes that destroyed the Roman Empire. I'm not sure that argument holds. First of all, these 10 horns are on the beast. When Rome is in its worldwide dominion, they don't come from outside, they grow on the beast. If somebody wants to say, oh, this number 10 is the expression of modern day Europe, then one problem certainly arises, that is, when the little horn has grown up, there are only 8 horns left. 10 minus 3 plus 1, that's 8. So the number 10 is not the continuous number that implies the divided Europe after the reign of Rome. Rather, the 10 could be seen as the worldwide, from the Christian perspective, dominion of Rome, which is then continued. When Europe is split up, or the former Roman Empire is split up, it is continued in a power that grows out of the Roman Empire. That little horn cannot be Islam, for instance. That would come from outside. So you're looking at a power growing out at the end of the traditional Roman Empire, the imperial Rome, which grows from inside the kingdom or the empire, and which is different in nature. Martin Luther and many of the reformers pointed to the papacy, which is different. It combines religion and state. It presents itself as a representative of God on earth, and thus a substitute for Jesus Christ. And the glamour and the power of that papacy throughout the medieval age is well known to anyone. Now, it is said about this little horn, especially in the further explanation in verse 25, following: He shall speak words against the Most High, and wear out the saints of the Most High, and he shall think to change the times and law, and shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half time. So there are 4 sentences placed in parallel. The first and the third one has to do with the horn's attack on God. The second and the fourth of these sentences in verse 25 have to do with the attack on the people of God. Let's look at the last one first. He shall wear out or wage war against the saints of the Most High. I was reading from the English Standard Version. And then they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half. There is always something peculiar going on with the time periods in the book of Daniel. The expressions are never really normal. In this case, you have the phrase idan, idanan, and then you have half of that. That is a phrase often translated periods. And here it's taken to be 3.5, so that the second time it's mentioned, it is understood in the dual form, that is indicating 2. Now this is the same word that is used about the 7 periods that will come on Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. So some would say, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, well, if it is symbolic and prophetic in chapter 7, Why isn't that also the case in chapter 4? And the simple answer is, in chapter 4, though you have symbols, the big metaphor about Nebuchadnezzar as a tree, the story itself is a historical narrative, and it is explicitly in verse 31 or 34, depending on versification, it is explicitly stated that this period will come to an end. When that period finished, was completed. However, Nebuchadnezzar's experience, as I already said, is a prelude to understand why and how God is judging. That is, it is a prelude to chapter 7. But the periods here are different, and in chapter 4 they are definite because they're called 7 periods. Now, very likely this period covers the last period from beginning of the 6th century. Some would say 533, when the Codex Justinianus was established, the law of Justinian. Others would say 538. From that period, and you count the 1260 years, you come to the time where the papacy received an almost mortal blow in history. Now, let me move a little on, because it is also said about this little horn that it will aspire to, seek to, attempt to change times and law. Now, the word for time here is different from the one that was used about the periods, Idan. Now, here it is Zeman. Both of these terms pop up in Daniel's prayer in 2:21, this foundational expression about the fact that God is the one, 2:21, the one that changes times and seasons, who removes kings and establishes kings. But we can look at a closer connection to the expression here in chapter 7. In the preceding chapter, Daniel had a clash with the Medo-Persian Empire about the law for worship. You remember the story about Daniel thrown into the lion's den, where the whole issue was, who would he worship? That is, which law would he follow? The Aramaic word for law, dat, was used repeatedly about the unchangeable law of the Medians and the Persians, but the only law that is never to be changed is the law of God. And that law of God, dat, is mentioned in chapter 6, and that clashes with the Medo-Persian, the human law. It's a law of worship. Now, the little horn, as these narratives point to the major enemy throughout history, the little horn makes an attempt to change the law of God. Notice that the same phrase, shana, for change, was used about the Medians and Persian laws that could not be changed. Now, this is what the little horn attempts to make a change in the law of God, in specific, in relation to worship. You may look at the clearest expression of the law of God, the 10 Commandments, and ask yourself, where in the 10 Commandments do you find the law that deals with worship? And it is the 4th commandment, the Sabbath commandment. When later the book of Revelation reuses these texts of Daniel 7, especially in Revelation 13 and 14, it also speaks about the attack on the law of God. It quotes the Sabbath commandment in chapter 14, verse 7. It speaks about genuine worship. Worship is the issue, Do we want to worship Christ, the Son of Man, alone? Or do we want to follow and thereby implicit worship a human or a statue a human has set up? In the end, the chapter is an appeal to the people of God throughout history to worship the Son of God alone, not to seek to win or gain power by the use of force, to accept that the only one who is worthy to reign forever is the one who would never abuse his power, the humble, the lowly, Jesus Christ, who came down to die as a sacrifice for human beings. Thank you for listening to tidbit number 2 from Daniel 7, and welcome back when we move into the exciting chapter that follows, chapter 8.